Cara van de Graaf is a poet and teacher who is currently bringing her many talents to the faculty at Utah Valley University. She holds a PhD in creative writing from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she was Chancellor's Fellow and a Distinguished Dissertation Fellow, an MFA in writing from the University of Pittsburgh, where she was a K. Leroy Irvis Fellow, and a BA in English from Purdue University. Over the last decade, her poetry has been published in many venues, including the Southern Review, Agni, New England Review, Crazy Horse, Alaska Quarterly Review, and the 2010 Best New Poets Anthology. And her first book, titled Spitting Image, won the 2016 Crab Orchard First Book Prize in Poetry and is forthcoming from Southern Illinois University Press in 2018. Her poetry is both lovely and surprising. She writes with easy and accessible language, but her metaphors and meaning are more complex, offering her readers very human personal insights that are both deep and delightful. In Poem in the Corner of a Young Girl's Mouth, for example, she uses the familiar images of a watercolor painting, a string of pearls, and parted lips, bringing them together in a new way that creates a poem about the challenges of womanhood that is greater than the sum of its parts. Cara, or maybe I should say Dr. van de Graaf, is also committed to her teaching. She is one of the editors of Lightbox Poetry, an online resource for teachers that explores the place of poetry in the classroom. As a teacher, she focuses on helping her students connect their classroom studies with their lives outside of school and prepares them to use writing in many contexts. An accomplished writer and teacher and scholar, please welcome Cara van de Graaf to the stage.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for getting out of bed today. It was a harrowing journey down today on the highway. I felt like I was in one of those, in the movies when they're doing like a car chase, high speed down the highway. I kept thinking things were going to start exploding on the sides of the highway because it was very intense coming down I-15 today. So I appreciate that you took the time to get here in terrible weather and on a day where you would probably like to be in your pajamas. Me too. I kind of would too. We could have all come in pajamas. Why didn't we think of this, Spencer? Okay, so I'm going to read to you for a little bit today out of this book. And before I do that, I just want to talk to you for a moment about how I think about the work that I'm about to read to you, how I think about it, and what I'm hoping that it does. And if you've looked a little bit at some of these poems, you'll probably know that one of the central things I'm interested in as a writer is thinking about bodies, thinking about not just what it means to have a body, but what it means to be a body, what it means to live inside a body, and in what ways that shapes our realities and ourselves as human beings. And so I'm curious often in my poems about where we get these ideas about what our bodies mean, about the way that we look and the way that we interact with, how do we understand, how do we get these ideas about what our bodies mean about our identities and about who we can be. And so I think as a writer, that language is one of the places that we learn this, that the words we use to talk about bodies and to frame bodies, our own bodies and other people's bodies, this is one place that we learn some of these ideas. But there are others that I'm very interested in, including art and art history. I'm very interested in how we have considered the human form across the history of art and in the contemporary of art. I think another way that we get these understandings is our relationships, right? Especially our relationships with our families, because those are the bodies we came from. And then we often find ourselves growing up, at least I did, sort of modeling or fashioning ourselves after those other bodies and how they kind of see themselves and their identities. And okay, go with me here because I feel like you're going to say, oh, she's taking a left turn and we're off the map. But another thing I want to put on the table here that I can talk to you about today through these poems is the bodies of animals. I'm really interested in the bodies of animals and how they become sort of foils for ourselves and our own bodies, and how we start to sometimes project ideas about identities by drawing comparisons to our bodies, from our bodies to animals' bodies, or from distancing perhaps sometimes ourselves from animal bodies. And so I want to kind of focus today in reading from this book to you on exploring those four threads. So I'm going to read some poems to you today that I think, I hope, will help you understand how poems can help us get at the nuances and the complexities of these things, which often are kind of invisible to us. Like, we maybe don't spend a ton of time thinking about, like, a cow that we pass on the highway on our way to school or work or family or friends, or you know, we don't spend that time thinking about it, but those things sit underneath the way that we live and talk and be human beings. And I think if we don't think about them, then we lose the opportunity to kind of interrogate, all right, well, how do I have this understanding of who I am? And so that's how I think about this work. I'd like to start briefly with a foray into art. I'm going to read you a couple art poems. And the first one is an ekphrastic poem. And so you may have learned about this already in your degree program here. But an ekphrastic poem is a poem that's written after a piece of art. Traditionally, this is a visual piece of art, although writers today in the contemporary have a more liberal understanding of what gets to be ekphrastic, and so you might find some, maybe surprising poems that people identify as ekphrastic. This particular poem is written after a court portrait that I became very, very interested in. And it comes from Spain in the year around 1680. And so you can imagine, there's still a court. There are still kings and queens. This is still a very important thing at this time. And so they had a court portraitist, and his name is Juan Carreño de Miranda. And he kind of did a bunch of portraits, not only of people who came to court and the royalty, but also of these sort of strange collection of beings and people that they held at court because they thought they were, kind of cool or weird or interesting, or they couldn't be seen in other places. And this painting is about one of those. It's called La Monstra Vestida, which means roughly the monster in clothes. And so I'll tell you in the poem a little bit about the child that the painting is about. La Monstra Vestida. There isn't room for anything else. All body, costumed in red. Fabric stretched over wood, entire width of a canvas. Only 6, but she weighs as much as a full-grown man. Round-bellied, surly. She is part of a collection of anomalies, like a pug-faced dog or a dwarf, a yellow-crowned parrot, its throat such vivid orange, the court had never seen it before. In this museum, too, she is an anomaly, a body I half recognize as my own, a familiar I project horror onto, like a mother. Every brushstroke threatens to unravel us, where the ribs of her dress unfasten, where her pursed lips, almost elegant, obscure her teeth, stitches pulling in a seam. Ladies at court couldn't help but love her, their figures appearing by contrast that much closer to perfection. Each hand clasps a globe of fruit, tinged red, where tiny breasts might be, as though a parody of the ideal woman. Little jolts of sweetness she holds on to until the posing is over, and they find their way into the stomach, that place where we bury things until they become us. I'd like to read you another poem about art next. And this is a poem that I wrote out of a couple of interests of mine. First, I went to Rome. And if you have been to Rome, you know that it is full of statue bodies. And so part of this is about my experience of being in Italy and seeing some of this art history that I told you I've kind of been really influenced by. And the other thing that I think it is pretty inspired by is my childhood obsession and love with the mythic figure of the Medusa. And I used to go to the school as a young girl and take out all the mythology books, and then everyone would make fun of me because there would be like strange paintings on the cover. But I've been obsessed with the Medusa since I was a child. And so there is some thinking about her in here, but there's also an epigraph to this poem, a quote from another poet, Percy Shelley. And this is from his poem on the Medusa of Leonardo da Vinci in the Florentine Gallery. And here is the quote about Medusa he writes in his poem. Yet it is less the horror than the grace which turns the gazer's spirit into stone. The poem is called Contrapposto, which is an art history term. It's about this idea that there's sort of a most aesthetically pleasing way to kind of stand and position yourself and your body. And it's sort of, if you'd like to try this at home, you can shift your weight kind of to one hip and then have the other hip jutting out, just like Michelangelo's David. And this was the idea of like, this is how the body looks best. So not only can you go home and look at art in a new way and think about the contrapposto, now you have a new idea for your next date because you can know exactly how you need to stand to look your best. Okay, so this poem is called Contrapposto. All day long, I touched the broken faces of men. I watched their features crumble, a chevron gone from a lip, the side of a head smashed off, leaving half a gunshot eye. Ancients, I have entertained your arguments and illusions. I have listened, but I still see your gods all knocked apart, divine back to human, human back to stone. That night, the August heat conjured an animal stench in the streets of the old city, punishing us as we slept near the cramped window. I dreamed of our elders' sick love of symmetry. Persuaded, I believed my own face was remade in stone, cracks rising up like welts over my jaw. In the morning, I woke, and you found me no longer beautiful. So I'd love to read you a little bit now of some of the poems in the book that think about how we inherit our senses of our bodies and ourselves through family. And that's kind of a pretty strong arc of this book of poems. I'd like to read you first the poem that was mentioned in the introduction, which is called Poem in the Corner of a Young Girl's Mouth. That coy meeting, which is beginning and ending all at once. Anatomical oversight. No name for it, I know. What would she sound like? A good girl speaks only when spoken to, is flat like a watercolor, which means the light is always hitting the same place on her hair. Her hands are always folded like a reflex, as if they are hiding something. If you can't say the words, you secret them into your hand. Little whispers she collects like thread or fancy buttons off her mother's dresses, each one round, as an oyster pearl. Mother says, this is what ladies know. There is a price for speaking, for the lips parting. The mouth has to break every time. I like to read that poem, especially in connection with what we were just talking about, because there's kind of an imagination of the speaker, the poem kind of becoming a piece of art in the middle of it. Like she becomes this sort of frozen watercolor, which I'm interested in as kind of a tie between my experience and art history. And now I kind of want to use a more scientific lens of thinking about my family history. The book is called Spitting Image, but when I researched that term and its kind of ancestry, and I guess you wouldn't call it etymology because it's not a word, but it's, I mean, maybe you would, it's a phrase. And I found out that spitting image, while it's the dominant way that we use that phrase today, there also used to be a splitting image, like the idea of being split off from something else and kind of being part of it. And so I did a poem called Spitting Image, and then I also have a poem called Splitting Image. And so here's Splitting Image. I have my mother's eyes. I have my mother's nose. The Weiss family nose, she calls it. I see its echo on my face like a photograph, Xeroxed until it is all grain. Features present, but out of focus. On the radio, I listened to doctors who thought the placenta could not be crossed. There was the mother, and then there was the child, alive but adjacent, like two countries. And now they look in the blood and see it isn't true. Fetal cells stay alive in the mother, are not attacked, though the DNA is foreign. This happens even if the child isn't born, even if it is a map for someone who never was. Our flesh is never our flesh alone. My mother changed her name when she married, and I changed mine, though we still carry that older name written in our features. They avoid erasure, even though Weiss means covered over and blanked. Weiss means forgotten. Sometimes it means bleached, the way photographers dodge a dark spot on a negative, reveal the architecture of an image underneath. I think because we just talked about it, I'd also like to read you the Spitting Image poem. So you have all of the spitting and splitting together in this reading, tied up in a little package for you. So this poem's called Spitting Image. I wait to hear her fall asleep, hide under the bed. My mother with her dark hair pinned flat. My mother like a small bird suspended above. What separates us? Thin planks, a mattress, soft things she uses to comfort herself. I press my palms flat against wood. Now she shifts, sits up on the bed. I see only the shadowed pillars of her feet, feel only my breath, its calculable measure. I try not to give myself away. When she settles, her presence ticks away slowly, hangs in the air. I listen to the bed, its creaking, as she starts to slip off. I am so still now, waiting. Any moment, I'm going to disappear. Am I the only weirdo who did this kind of thing as a child, would like hide in spaces undetected where you weren't supposed to be and observe stealthily like a wildlife photographer what the rest of your family was doing? Maybe I am in this room, the only person. I'd like to read you some animal poems now, to kind of give you this other way that I'm thinking about it. My favorite thing about this book is that I never know where anything in it is. even though I wrote it. It's different when it's a physical object than when you're layering it together, in your Microsoft Word file, and you feel like you have an exact sense of where everything is. And then they make it an object, and you're like, I've never seen any of this before. Okay, can we continue, please? My strange obsession with science and the body. And this poem originated in part because I watched too many BBC Earth documentaries. And this particular documentary was about the whale, which is an animal I'm really interested in because sometimes we call people whales, right? If they're large people, we compare our bodies to the bodies of these other animals as almost kind of like metaphors in a weird way. And so I'm very interested in the whale. And I learned this thing about the whale that absolutely boggled me. And this is according to the BBC Earth, so you know it's true because they say it in a British accent. So, whales can create sounds in excess of 180 decibels, louder than a rocket launch that carry underwater for more than a mile. And then because I am approaching the whale and kind of thinking about it as also a literary figure, I had to have a quote from Melville because of his Moby Dick. And here's how Melville talked to us about the body of the whale. Speak, mighty head, and tell us the secret thing that is in thee. So I've written this poem about a visit to the Natural History Museum in London. And I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but there's an enormous whale, like a big blue whale, and a skeleton. It's not still alive. A skeleton is there in kind of the lot, like it's hanging over a giant room. And so this is about the experience of being there with that skeleton. It's called Giants of the Sea. At the Natural History Museum, I stand inside, the great skull tipped upward, the ribs circling me like a gate. You giant, you patron saint of taking up space. Just the skeleton hangs from reinforced steel cording, the mammal in some too massive to survive air. And while I fit my small body inside its bones, the living ones swim still underwater, each one a blue organ of the earth that beats and beats, circulates over hundreds of miles. They live by refusing to be quiet, by remaking the world with their sound. In the open waters of Alaska, whales migrate each year with their calves, hunt sardines, silver gasps, all one mind, and so much flesh. Whales build a funnel of speech inside their skulls, a song they can shoot with that stops the shoals swarming, pushes it into frenzy. In the museum, cloaked in this body, I feel my loudness tunneling up like stunned fish shunting toward the surface, ready to be taken gently in the mouth, ready to meet the weapon they were made for. Let me see how much. Okay, I'm gonna read you one or two more little guys. I think, yes. I think we have time. Okay, here's another animal poem that kind of fuses this, for me, way of thinking about family bodies and animal bodies. And this is about, maybe some of you have this experience too. My grandparents had a giant piano in their house growing up. We did not, but I was fascinated by this thing. Can I play the piano? No. Could I play the piano then? No. But I liked to pretend I could play the piano, and I was very interested in it as its own kind of body. It's grand piano. It's so big and elaborate. I was very attracted to it. And so then I grew up and I wrote a weird poem about it, which is basically what I do with everything. It's called Poem in the Shape of a Grand Piano. Carvings spine over the cabinet's front, hairline, delicate as the scaffolding of a wren's wing. And the etched case, too, is the wren's patterned body, its breastbone like a prow, the Steinway's curved rim. I want to hold the keys against my palm, the same cleft of my hand where once I held a small bird as it failed. When it happened, I felt a door shut in the chest, heavy as a glossed lid. Watched the eyes, still black, only the way out was closed. And silence. But before silence, a low sound flocking the back of the throat, trailing off, the way I imagine the first key on the lip of the piano might sound, if I struck it softly, if I let myself. Let's see where. All the way back to the beginning. I want to just end with two short poems. And these are poems that, for me, engage with my way of thinking about how does language frame and transform experience and imagine an experience into being that maybe didn't quite happen how you say it did. And then how does that help us think through some of these issues about the body that I'm so interested in this book? First, the poem Dream with Water Beneath the Floorboards. Red matchstick I thumb alive and send ahead of me through the dark. Little emissary, little locket of light that lets the eye wick to the cellar's walls, the green line of mineral where flood rises up waist high. Groundwater seethes through cracks in the mortar, laces between stones, their flat, smooth faces already buried. All night I ferry buckets to the surface. All night my fingers seam together and I climb. My sleeping like one long flight of stairs. My bucket like a mouth that won't drown. In the end, I envied the bucket, the way all things that are empty want to be filled. And here is this last and perhaps weirdest one. And I chose it because it really transforms like an everyday experience, I hope. One that maybe you have had or that you've seen happening. And it, for me, uses it to think about body and identity and gender and some of these other things that the poems have been exploring. It's called Sonnet with a Wishbone in the Throat. I trust the hen and cut the breast clean, pliable, soft with cartilage. I thought my mouth could swallow it whole, but the bone went brittle, broke through the skin of my neck like two thorns. Its prongs scissored out above my clavicle. Windpipes split in a perfect Y. When I speak, each phrase kaleidoscopes, modifies, a duet of whispers. I lip into air. I sound sweet when I want to be bitter. I bite back my anger's flare. My voice box grows into an echo chamber, buzzes, double alive. Forgive me, I must say everything twice. Once to punish, once to entice. Thank you, guys, for listening. And I saved some time so that we might talk with one another a little bit, or if you have a question you'd like to ask me, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. So I think we got 15 or 20 minutes. Is that true? Yeah? Perfect. Hi.
I had a question. I noticed lots of your poems seem to tie like death and decay with water. Is there anything that inspires that?
I think that's an interesting question. Death and decay and water. Surprisingly enough, I am not afraid to swim. even though the book may lead you to believe otherwise. You know what? I have a weird answer to this question. And one of my primary interests during my doctoral degree, because when you do a doctoral degree in creative writing, not only are you studying in workshops and kind of taking craft courses and things like that help you strengthen your writing. I also took, PhD level lit courses and theory courses. And so one of my areas of specialization, because I'm a poet, was Romanticism and Gothicism, which is a period of literature that really helped shape, I think, a lot of the ways we think about what poems do today. And so this is a very weird answer to your question. I get it, but I'm getting back there. And so one of the things I became obsessed with about the Gothic, and it's a quality that I see maintained in many American poems, especially poems by women. And the Gothic kind of originated as a female genre in a lot of ways, is that there's an obsession between boundaries, right? Between where does one thing stop and then where does another thing begin? And I think since I was a child, I've actually loved water. But one of the things I love about water is that it's see-through, right? It doesn't really look as if anything has changed beneath the surface, and you can kind of step into it. But things do change, right? You're kind of weightless under the water. And then have you had this experience of being fascinated of poking your hand up from underneath the water to above the surface? And it looks like such a hard line, right? But it feels like nothing. Yeah. And so I think because I'm so interested in this question in my book around bodies, what is part of me and what is not part of me, that imagery about water and the kind of seamlessness and frighteningness of not understanding where those boundaries are fixed, that's terrifying for us, I think, right? We hate anything that comes out of our body. We don't want to have anything to do with it. We just completely disown it. After that, it's on its own, right? That boundary is really kind of enforced by us. And so I think if I were to give you my poet answer, that would be my answer, right? Because for me, there's something terrifying about the fact that there is no solidity between boundaries in the image of the water. If I kind of think about that in terms of the body. Does it make some sense? It makes crazy, weird sense, but it makes some sense. Yeah, hi.
Just listening to you read your poems now, I love hearing poems read loud more than I do reading them.
Yeah.
It makes a difference, but the way your intonation worked, I was always surprised when the poem ended. Nothing you said sounded like, okay, this is the end of the poem. I wanted to know if that's on purpose, you know?
Well, there is such a thing, which if you're in this class, you may get to experience this semester, called poet voice. I mean, do you know what I'm talking about? We call it poet voice, and it is like this dramatic way of reading that we love to do it. We love to do this to kind of put emphasis on the words. And I think then there's a lot of ways that what that way of speaking does is it helps you kind of anticipate when the end is coming, like there's a tone and intonation in there. I actually took a class on reading my work aloud when I was in my MFA. That's when I took it. I took it with, surprisingly enough, a nonfiction writer. That's not who I imagined I would take this course from. His name was Lee Goodkind. And he had this argument to us, which is that affected way of reading actually gets in the way of people being able to experience what you're saying in the language. Do you know what I mean? And so there are a lot of poets who will give you a different answer about this, that they'll say that the line is meant to structure the way that the poem sounds, right? And they'll adhere more closely to that. But I prefer to read my poems out loud in a way that I'm hoping will allow the reader to follow the line of thinking and the line of seeing the best that they possibly can, at least because for me, I find it challenging, especially if the poem's not like right in front of my face. Sometimes I kind of tune out when people are talking out loud, and then I lose the thread of the poem. And so I think in like a sneaky way that my weird, perhaps reading approach is designed to kind of try and sidestep that. You know what I mean? Yeah. Hi.
Along those same lines, I noticed in reading your poem versus hearing it, I couldn't really, not that I couldn't understand, but your line breaks and punctuation, I just thought, what's the thinking behind those? They seemed a little bit unusual or surprising, like sometimes the whole thought would just, there'd be a big space between them. How do you decide how you're going to space?
Now, do you mean just the way the poem physically
Yeah.
is laid out on the page?
You know, because I've read these and then you've read some of them and they make more sense when you say them.
Yeah.
And I just thought, what determines how you lay it out?
It's a fabulous question, and I have to tell you, it's a question I work all the time on with my own students, because I think, especially because many of us have this experience today that generations ago we would have of having poetry be part of our lives as young people. It's something that we kind of read and look at. It's harder to kind of think about why those decisions get made, right? Like, well, did you just was it getting too long for the page and so we just cut it off? Or, why is this really short or really long? And there's not going to be an easy answer to that. It's going to be different in terms of each poem that we're looking at. Part of it sometimes is purposeful in terms of hoping that the form will in some way engage with the content. And so when I talk about this with my students, I say, if you're going home and just chopping it up because you think it looks pretty that way only, or, because it looked like that was time to end the line, you're probably going to have readers kind of, react in a puzzling way to what you've done. But there are two main things that you can do to kind of think about bringing order and structure to that. And the first one, I think, is to kind of imagine that that form has a relationship to the content, that they're mutually supporting things, that that the content of the poem informs how it is shaped, and then, of course, because the shape is the container for the language, right? That's automatically going to change what can happen inside the content. And so they're kind of married, I think. And so in this poem I read you, Splitting Image, which was about DNA, I did a kind of strange, almost like DNA sequencing or chromosome kind of pattern across the page to make that happen. A poem that I didn't read to you, but that you can see in the book somewhere, pretty sure it still exists, is a poem called The Poetics of Fatness. And it had such a strange form that they printed it sideways in the book. And so it starts small and it grows and it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it gets bigger. And if you read the poem, this is intimately linked, of course, to the content of the poem. But the other way, really, I think, is intuitive. And that's by asking yourself as a writer, how do I want the reader to feel when they read this? Like, what kind of experience of the poem do I want to have? How am I feeling the language that I'm writing? What kind of form would shape and respond to where I seem to be going? And so it's not an exact science like everything in writing, annoyingly, yes. But I think those questions can kind of help you start to shape some thinking about in your own work or in others' work. Like, why does this look the way that it does, Yeah? Good. Hi.
You read a few today, poems talking about speaking versus not speaking and
Yes.
hiding
Yes.
words and stuff. So I'm just wondering, with you being a writer, do you feel like poetry allows you to speak about certain things or to speak in general in a way that you can't in regular life, and how does that affect your writing?
Yeah, I think so. I think, yes, thank you for noticing that. You're right. It's all over the place. And then, what the sad thing is, if you as writers start accumulating poems, what you'll find out is that your subconscious knows more about you than you do. And that you'll have all of these poems and you'll start to notice things like this, like, oh, why have I written about speaking in mouths 700 times? Maybe that's worth thinking about. But I have really thought about it. It's become part of the conscious structuring of the project of this book. So I talked to you at the beginning of our time together today about how I'm thinking about bodies and identity and how we get to be the humans we are or not get to be the humans we wish to be sometimes. And I think I have had this experience as a human being of feeling kind of separated from my body in that way. That, like, as a young person, I don't think that my body allowed me the kind of identity that I wished for. And so there was a kind of ability not to speak about that, or not to speak out of the position that I wished to speak from. And so for me, I think the poems are a sort of reclaiming of that speech in certain ways, that maybe I can't or couldn't speak through the vectors of speech that were available to me based on where I was placed physically as a body at that time. But by reimagining reality, by reimagining the world, by using language and getting to kind of make my own way of thinking about things, then maybe there's a way of speaking that doesn't exist when you're just hanging out and drinking soda with your friends, right? Do you know what I mean? That maybe this is a space, poems are a space where we get to use language in ways that we don't get to use it anywhere else. And if we get to use language in ways that we're not using it anywhere else, we get to make meanings that we don't get to make anywhere else either. See what I mean? Yeah. Let's see. Hi.
What did your research process look like for writing this book? Did you just pull from your memories, or were there specific scientific things that you did in that specific?
Yeah, both, I think. In some instances, it's just like I kind of mind, when I was young and first starting to write poetry, one of my professors said to me that poems are often about our obsessions, by which I don't mean like collecting every Star Wars memorabilia that exists, although more power to you, write those poems. But, what I mean is sometimes we have an experience as a human being and it catches us in a certain way. And sometimes it's a big experience, it's, huge. And then sometimes we don't even know why. This little experience that we have, we keep coming back to it in our brains, right? And so I think those are the moments out of my life that I often wind up shaping into poems. There's something about this, that there's something in there that needs to be teased out for me, or that I need to understand. But you're right. I'm a kind of curious person. I like finding stuff out. I like knowing things about whales. I like watching The Crown and finding out all of the dirty secrets of the royals. I like, especially I think about the natural world, which seems kind of strange to some people, I think, because I'm a writer and I'm so humanities-based, but I think I have a real fascination with the world. And so those moments, like I listened to the radio and I was like, oh my God, we thought that when we lost children, they were just gone, but they're not, right? They survive inside of our bodies. They're kind of housed in our bodies. That really struck me. And so I don't know that I went out and decided I would like to know about what happens to DNA of babies. I didn't do that, but I encountered something from being a human in the world, and then I decided to dig into it. And so that's often the case about facts like that, paintings, all these kinds of things kind of come from my natural interests. And I think any of you can do that too, You don't have to cultivate special highbrow interests that you may not have to write poems that are interesting, because it was a joke earlier, but you could write Star Wars poems if you wanted to. Trust me, I've had students who have tried. So, whatever animates you as a human being, I think that's the place to tap into, to kind of think about, well, where could I go with this? What could this help me think about? Yeah? Let's see, I think we have 4 more minutes. Does anyone have a last question? Or comment? Or movie recommendation? Yes.
Not a movie recommendation,
Mhm.
and because of that, I live in awe of poets. And so I just really intimidated. What do you say to your students or people who aren't experiencing poetry? How do you start? How do you break into
Yeah.
becoming more confident in the genre?
Yeah, you know, I think that tons and tons and tons of young writers I meet have the same experience. And I think it's due in part to what I was talking about before. We don't grow up with this the way we grow up with narrative and story, right? Narrative and story is sort of baked into us in this culture as human beings. We intuit the structures of that. You know, they don't feel scary to us. But poems have those things too. We just don't have that built up, rote kind of wagon wheel path that we're like, okay, it's going to go this way. But the good news is you can build it. You have to read, you know? You read, you come to events like this. You think, you take your classes. We require all of our creative writing majors at Utah Valley to take workshops in multiple genres. Even if they plan to specialize only in prose, many of them wind up sitting in front of me. And what I tell them about that is, you know, it's going to feel weird, uncomfortable, maybe scary to try and form language into poems if you're used to forming language in different ways. But that is the use of that practice. Discomfort does not necessarily mean bad, right? Sometimes it's necessary. I think we all have to go through some level of like frustration, discomfort, feeling like we're not getting there to write. You know, I wrote dozens and dozens and dozens more poems during this period of my life than are actually collected in this book because some of them, you know, failed. Some of them sucked, even though I had spent years and years writing poems already. So I guess I would say the first thing to know is there's nothing deficient about you. If you go on your own time or in a class and you write a poem and you're like, ugh, you know, it's not, why not working? That's kind of a quintessential experience of being a writer, I think. It's how we become a better writer. And if you push yourself to understand what ways of using language exist in these other forms that I'm less familiar with, you are making yourself a better prose writer because you understand things about the usage of language that you just didn't before, most likely. And so I think yes is my answer. Yes, it's hard, and it will be hard no matter what. You know, that writing is hard, but it's also worth it, I think. It's also a really important thing that we do as human beings, to talk to each other and know each other and understand each other. So, yeah? Good? Happiness? Okay, thank you for being here.